In many cases, a REST API needs to have authentication and access control to protect API from malicious requests. For instance, you may define whether a user needs to log in and has some specific authorities to access a specific endpoint. AlchemyJ can help users enable security control on REST API via some configuration operations in an AlchemyJ workbook. We will be using the REST API sample model to demonstrate how to add security control on a REST API. We will use JSON Web Token, JWT, to store the user authentication information. To enable the JWT for REST API configuration, there are 4 definition worksheets we need to set up. We will use LDAP as the authentication server. So, we will first set up an LDAP server connection in the external resource worksheet. Next, we will set up the REST API login service to generate a token when authentication succeeds. Then, we will use the REST token authorization worksheet to configure how our API will process a JWT for authorization. Finally, we will use the REST API endpoint security to define who can access which function point. So, these are the steps we will need to take. Let's dive in. We are going to configure the LDAP information first. Go to the AlchemyJ ribbon. Click Add Definition and select External Resources. On the External Resources worksheet, there is an LDAP connection section. The first thing we need to do is to set the Disable column to blank so that this connection will be enabled. The LDAP connection ID is a unique name to identify this connection. We can just keep the default value here. It will be used when we set up the login service later on. Next, fill in the server URL and base path of our LDAP connection. Input an admin user and password to access the LDAP server. That's all we need to do for the LDAP connection. Let's move on to set up the REST API login service. Go to AlchemyJ ribbon, click Add Definition, and select REST API login service. The first property in the basic settings section is Enable Login Service. It is set to Yes when you first add the worksheet. We can keep it as it is. If later on, you want to disable the login service momentarily, you may set the value to No. LDAP and authentication source means that after the service extracts username and password from a request, they will be passed to an LDAP server for authentication check. If authentication succeeds, the username will become the logged-in username. I am using AlchemyJ version 4.1.1. In this version, it only supports LDAP. Let's move on to the login service settings section. This is where we configure the login request. We can use the default value settings here. Let me explain what it tells us. The login URL is /login. That means users can call this login endpoint by accessing the base URL and then /login. The request should contain a username field and a password field in its header. If authentication succeeds, it will return a response message with a body that is a JSON string as defined here. The $sign curly bracket fields are placeholders that will be replaced during runtime. Username is the username of the successfully logged in user. Authorities are the authorities of the user which are looked up from a database. This list is empty if REST API user detail service is not enabled. Next, login success handle function points means the function point you want to trigger after authentication succeeds. In this example, we will just leave it empty. And then we have a similar set of settings for the login failure event. The last property is user information store type. It can be JSON Web Token or session. Selecting JWT means the login service will generate a JWT with the login information. The details of JWT generation can be defined in JSON Web Token generation settings below. We will do that later. If you select Session, the login service will store login information in the server session, and a session ID will be returned as a cookie. In our example here, we will select JWT. In LDAP Authentication Settings section, we can define the LDAP connection we will use. Since we use the default LDAP connection ID when we define our LDAP connection in the external resource worksheet, we can leave the value as primary here. If you use another name for your LDAP connection, you'll need to set that name here. Next is the LDAP user DN replacement holder field. DN stands for distinguished name. It is the name that the login will actually pass to an LDAP server for authentication. Since different types of LDAP servers may use different DN syntax, this field allows you to define the DN syntax. Use curly bracket 0 as the placeholder for the username received from the request. In my environment, I use Microsoft Active Directory, so I set it to curly bracket 0 at matrix.com, where matrix.com is the domain name. As we set the login service to use JWT, we have to set up the JSON Web Token generation settings section. JWT secret is the secret key to use when generating the token. Expiration defines how long the token will become effective. It is in milliseconds. The default is 100,000 milliseconds, which means the token will not be usable after 100 seconds. Token location defines whether the token will be returned as a header field or a cookie field. The token name defines the name of the header field or the cookie field. Using the default values will be fine in our case. That's all the necessary information we need to set up for login service. There are many settings you can modify. If you want to know more, please check out our online help. Next, we need to set up the REST token authorization to tell the API where to find the token and how to process it when a request comes in. Go to the AlchemyJ ribbon. Click Add Definition and REST API Token Authorization. Similar to the REST Login Service worksheet, it has an Enable property. We will leave it as Yes. AlchemyJ supports two types of tokens: JWT and Database Token. Database token is used for server-to-server API calls, where we use an API key to identify a system instead of using an authentication server, such as LDAP. By default, database token authorization is disabled. In this example, we are using JWT, so we will only modify the JWT Web Token Authorization table. You can see that many properties in this table are the same as those in the REST Login Service worksheet. Make sure you put the same values in both places. I will only explain those new fields here. The first one is protected URL path. This defines which URL path will the API look for authentication information. The value is a URL pattern. /** means all resources under the base URL. Check the online help for the pattern syntax. Some users might use JWTs on front-end clients. To avoid the need of logging in again after a JWT token has expired, AlchemyJ supports a token refresh mechanism so that when a request to a secured resource is received, a refresh token will be generated. But generating a refresh token on every request may be inefficient. The token refresh interval defines the time a refresh token will be generated. Now that we have defined how our API validates a login, we come to the last step, which is to define the access right required for different resources. Go to the AlchemyJ ribbon. Click Add Definition and select REST API Endpoint Security. We use this worksheet to define which URL pattern requires what access right. This setting can be defined in this worksheet. We call that static access control. On the other hand, we can define such settings in a database and load them during runtime. This is more flexible since the access control setting can be changed after the API is generated. To keep this tutorial simple, we will use the static access control configuration. Thus, we set use external configuration to no. The static access control configuration has 4 columns. In HTTP method, select the HTTP method of the resource you want to protect. The sample function point uses the get method, so we just set get here. If you want all operations to be included, select all. Next, define the URL pattern for the resource to protect. The endpoint URL of function point 1 is endpoint group resource 1. Access operator controls the access right required for this resource. I set it to authenticated users so that any user that is logged in may access this function point. If you use /** to define all resources shall be protected. Please remember to add the login URL to be accessible by anyone. Otherwise, no one can log in. We have done all the configurations we need to do. Let's generate the API and verify if the JWT setup works. To generate the API, click Generate API in AlchemyJ ribbon. It triggers REST API generation and execution. Wait until my REST API is generated and started. If you see this application started message, it means the server has properly started. In Postman, create a request to endpoint group resource 1. The call should fail because the request does not contain any JWT token in the header. The call failed as expected. To log in and receive a JWT token, make a new request to login and provide the correct domain username and password in the header fields. After authentication passed, an authorization field can be found in response headers. After logging in successfully, a JWT is returned in the authorization header field. Copy the value and go back to Endpoint Group Resource 1 tab in Postman. In Request Header, paste the copied token value in the authorization field. Click Send. The response message of the endpoint has been returned. This means we have the proper right to access the endpoint. So, there you have it. We have set up access control to protect our API using LDAP and JWT. If you want to know the details of each property in those definition worksheets, our online documentation is definitely a good source to check out. Thanks for watching. Give us a thumbs up if you like it, and don't forget to subscribe for more tips and tricks on how to use AlchemyJ.